welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Somers Library for organizing this. I would like to thank all of you for coming out on such a beautiful day to be here, and for giving me the opportunity to speak about what's happening there in Ukraine. My name is Oksana Kulinich. I'm born here. I'm a Ukrainian American, but my heart is with Ukraine and my hopes are with Ukraine right now. We've been really following what's happening. So most of you have been following also the news about Ukraine, right? On February 24th, 2022, at 4 o'clock in the mornings, Ukrainians were woken up by bombs and missiles raining down on their city. I think the world was shocked. I was angry, I was shocked that this could be happening in the 21st century, in a sovereign European country that had 44 million people. And people are, Ukraine had been attacked and people are dying every day, still. So if you take a look at this map here, you can see it was like a blitzkrieg. They came from the north, they came from the east, and from the south. Does anybody know what happened in 2014?
They annexed Crimea.
Yeah, they annexed Crimea, which is that peninsula in the Black Sea, and what else?
They funded separatists in the Donbass.
Yes. Did you study this? Or...
No, I just love geopolitics.
Great, yeah. Yes, in the eastern part of Ukraine, they funded separatists, disguised as the Russian army, really, and they took over that section. And they had a fake referendum, which they're trying to do again. And whenever they take over a country, the first thing they do, when they attacked Ukraine, they change the curriculum. They get rid of anything Ukrainian, all the Ukrainian books there. They bring in Russian teachers and they start teaching in Russian, and everything is Russianized there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. If you take a look, so what's the capital of Ukraine? Kyiv, right? So Kyiv is right up there, and they thought that in a couple of days they would take out the Ukrainian government and put in a pro-Russian government. And we know that, fortunately, that did not happen. What's the name? Anybody know the river that goes down to the Black Sea?
I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but it's the Dnieper River.
Yeah, we say Dnipro in Ukrainian, but yes. So that kind of divides Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. So Western Ukraine had been under first Austria-Hungarian, part of Austria-Hungary, then it was under Poland, and then it was under part of the Soviet Union, and then it was independent Ukraine. But Eastern Ukraine was much longer under Russian domination. So that's why you hear Russian spoken a lot more there. And it's Russianized. But those people say, you know, we may speak Russian, but we're Ukrainian. We're not Russian. We don't want you here. So Russian aggression is nothing new in Ukraine, or in the world for that matter. Anybody know what it was called before this whole area collapsed, and what that totalitarian regime was called before? Russia, Ukraine, what was it called?
Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Yeah, so the whole area was called the Soviet Union, right? How many republics were part of the Soviet Union?
15.
15 republics were part of the Soviet Union, and Ukraine was the second largest republic. But all decisions were made where? In Moscow, right? In the Kremlin. What's another word? What is the Kremlin? You hear that word a lot, the Kremlin. So how would we equate that to U.S. government? What would that be? Like the White House, right? It's their government. Only they have a totalitarian government, We have a democracy here. We have 3 branches of government. What are they?
Executive,
And legislative, right? Well, in the Soviet Union or in Russia, there's only one. You know, it's one person decides everything. So all decisions at that time were made in Moscow. We had no choice. And who was the leader in the 1930s there? Stalin was, right? He was the leader of the Soviet regime, and he instituted a policy of Russification. Have you heard that word, Russification? Yeah. So Russification was an attempt to destroy Ukrainian culture, the language, and any traditions that were Ukrainian. Any teacher who taught in Russian was paid a lot more than the teacher who's taught in Ukrainian. Anybody who wanted to go to university and get a good job, they had to learn Russian. They had to speak Russian there. So that area became much more Russified there. Even now, I mean, I just saw a horrific photograph of a soldier who was recently killed, and he had lost his arm. They cut off his arm because he had a Ukrainian symbol on his arm. So anything Ukrainian, they just like try to destroy. So I want to, you know, in order to understand the war now, we have to go back to a little history. And I go to schools.
Can I add something?
Yes, this is my mom who fled Ukraine after World War II. So Maria.
Actually, I was in Kharkiv. That's the 2nd largest city in Ukraine, and it's much closer to the Russian border. So I was there as a Fulbright scholar. And I was there for 2 weeks. I remember it exactly. And I walked around. I was trying to buy a Ukrainian newspaper. And for 2 weeks, in the streets, in the shops, I heard absolutely no Ukrainian. So when I was trying to buy a newspaper, actually it's a huge square near the university, there was a gentleman speaking Ukrainian. He was trying to buy a newspaper. And I was shocked. So I said, for 2 weeks I've been here, I didn't hear any Ukrainian. It's the first time I hear some Ukrainian. He said, it's because I'm from Lviv, Western Ukraine, and not from Kharkiv.
Yeah.
But this is
What they
it
did.
was.
Yeah. So just to tell you a little bit of history of the 1930s, the Soviet government liquidated in the 1930s the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That was the main church in Ukraine. They pretty much killed off the bishops, the church hierarchy. And the church that was left was under Moscow control. They executed Ukrainian intellectuals. They had these fake show trials. So all the Ukrainian leaders, the artists, the teachers, the scientists were pretty much wiped out in the 1930s. Stalin closed the borders of Ukraine and took away every last grain of food from the starving people. He closed those borders in eastern Ukraine so people could not escape to get food. Millions of Ukrainians were deliberately starved to death, and 1/3 of them were children. This is known as the Holodomor, the famine genocide, or genocide by starvation of 1932-33. And this year marks the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor. And we're going to organize a student competition in hopefully as many high schools as we can throughout the US about the Holodomor. So you better participate. Okay, so So this is just one of the few photographs from the 1930s, because journalists, photographers were not allowed in Ukraine. That was prohibited, so they didn't get to show what was really happening there. It's one of the rare photographs. So Ukraine was not a safe place during World War II. If you take a look at the map, think of World War II, between what two totalitarian regimes do you see that Ukraine was?
Germany.
Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. See, people say Russia, but it was really all 15 republics. It was really the Soviet Union. But everybody thought, myself growing up all my life, I'm Ukrainian. Oh, you're Russian, you speak Russian. No, we're not Russian, I don't speak Russian, we're not the same. So Ukraine was between those two totalitarian regimes. And one of the Yale professors, his name is Timothy Snyder, he wrote a book called The Bloodlands, if any of you have heard of it. And he talks about Poland, Ukraine. That's where the most bloodshed occurred during World War II, Poland and Ukraine, because they were between. And when Germany invaded, they say Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Well, they took over 100% of Ukraine and only 5% of Russia. So really, Ukraine was the one that got hurt the most. So my parents, my mom and my father, they fled their beloved homeland during World War II, when the Russian communists started coming into the villages in the middle of the night. And my grandmother remembers that it was a brutally cold winter, and people started disappearing from their homes. They were either killed or sent to Siberia, to the Gulag. What's Gulag?
The Russian labor camp.
Yeah, the Soviet concentration camps, the hard labor camps. So my uncle was one of those that was sent there and spent 10 years in the Gulag mining for gold for the Soviets, until finally he had asylum after Stalin died. But so many lives were ruined. And over 2 million Ukrainians were forcibly taken to Germany as forced laborers. So my mom, now Maria, she's writing a book called Maria's Story, a Ukrainian family's survival during Soviet and Nazi occupation or regimes, yeah. So that's coming out, you know, because people don't tell their stories. I talked to so many of my friends, and they don't want to talk, their parents didn't want to talk about it. They were just so traumatized that they just didn't talk about it. So my mother, fortunately, you know, put all of this history down on paper.
I have a question.
Yes.
Russia was part of the Allies, you know, United States and England, and
Good question. So in 1939, Russia and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and they were allies. They were allies together until
2 years.
for 2 years, they were allies, Russia and Nazi Germany. And then in 1941, I think when
when the United States.
yeah, so they changed their whole history to show that World War II started in 1941, not 1939. You know, they changed the history of it, but yeah.
I read it that Putin describes his theory that Hitler made a mistake by not, instead of invading Russia, they should have partnered with Russia. And together, Russia and Germany would rule the world. And that's what's motivating him to do what he's doing now.
Well, the Russians, if you go back centuries to the Tsar's times, they've always had that imperialistic mentality, the Russian world, right? That this should all be part of our land.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing, you know, this imperialistic mentality.
Right.
I think 3/4 of Russians support what Putin's doing.
Right.
3/4. So it's not just Putin, it's the Russian mentality that needs to change in this war. You see, Ukraine is a large country. Does anybody know what the blue stands for in the flag?
The sky and the wheat fields.
Yes, the sky and you know,
The wheat fields.
and the wheat fields, yeah. So you see a lot of Ukrainian flags all over,
You
yes.
should put a red flower for the poppies growing.
I don't want anything red on my flag.
No, the poppies belong to the wheat fields, that's all.
Okay. When did the Soviet Union collapse? Anybody know? When Ukraine? Yes, 1991. Finally, Ukraine gained its independence. Well, at that time, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And so, in 1994, 3 years later, United States, United Kingdom, and Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum, confirming Ukraine's existing borders and giving security assurances for Ukraine's sovereignty, in exchange for Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons. Do you think any other country would give up their nuclear weapons anymore? I don't think so. So right now, the world is on edge, as Russia has turned Ukraine's largest nuclear power facility, located near the town of Zaporizhia, which is kind of eastern Ukraine, into a military base. They have their military inside there. And finally, the threat has triggered fears of a nuclear catastrophe. And finally, officials from the International Atomic Energy Agency have been allowed to come and inspect the facility. Yes?
Do you think that if Ukraine didn't give up nuclear weapons, Putin would still have attacked?
Good question. I don't know, because we can't see what he's thinking. Nobody can predict what he's going to do. I mean,
It's like Hitler.
just like Hitler, right? It's hard to predict. So we didn't stop the Russians when they invaded Chechnya in 1999. Some of you might remember that, how they just bombed Grozny, the city there, and totally destroyed Grozny. We didn't stop them in 2008. Who did they invade then?
Georgia.
Georgia, and they took about a fifth of Georgia, and they made their breakaway republics, so-called breakaway, where they put their Russians in there and say, we're defending Russian speakers. So Georgia they invaded. Who did they invade 2014? Ukraine, right? They took over Crimea, which is such an important part, because that southern border is where all the grain is being exported. Ukraine is still the breadbasket of Europe, and all this grain they're blocking. And you know, they made a treaty with Turkey, so now they're finally allowing some grain out of the ports in Odessa, which is one of the big cities, a port on the Black Sea. And that is still under Ukrainian control. So that, they're finally, you know, being able to get that out. So the world wasn't paying attention and opted for a policy of appeasement. And let's be dependent on that Russian gas and oil, right? That they did, they had those pipelines and all. Well, today, Ukrainians once again are fighting for something that this country holds very dear. What do you think that is? Democracy, freedom, right? And let me tell you, you may not think it, but we do have freedom here. I was in Ukraine when it was still part of the Soviet Union, and my relatives were petrified that someone would find out that I was from America. They told everybody I was from Poland. And if I wore this there, I would have been arrested for anti-Soviet propaganda. You couldn't have blue and yellow, you know, that was symbol of Ukrainian nationalism, right? People didn't wear things like this. Everything Ukrainian was like put down at that time. So when I came back to America, I just wanted to kiss the ground here, because I realized what a difference being in a totalitarian system and not being able to speak and being afraid. And here, you know, we can be against the government, we can say things. You can't there.
Can
Such
I
a
say
difference.
something?
Yes.
I went to Ukraine in 1991, when it was beginning to pull away from Russia, but it was still under the Russian influence. And I went to Western Ukraine, because that's where my family comes from. And what really amazed me was how the Russian influenced every day. For example, you went into the bus driver wouldn't let you on, you had to buy the ticket, but you had to give them something in the hand, otherwise you couldn't get on. And in so many other places. For example, I was driving with my cousin, just sightseeing, and there was a police car standing on one side looking at us, and they stopped us, and they asked my cousin, show me your papers. And me, I'm quiet, I'm not saying a word. I said to myself, if they hear my accent or whatever, they wanted money. 2 police guys to go through. But my cousin, he started taking pictures on his cell phone. So they let us go. I mean, the corruption at that time was incredible.
Yeah.
And
You're right.
that's what you get from Russia.
Yeah, that mentality of getting away, you know, getting away with it, beating the system, right?
Yeah.
And not having your own initiative
Right.
to do things. Yeah, that was the whole communist mentality. Yeah. So the Ukrainians want freedom. Freedom not only for the land that they call their home, but freedom from a tyrant with no morals or compassion for human life. In attacking Ukraine, Russia is leaving a trail of death, devastation, while committing horrific war crimes that are now being documented against innocent civilians, including children. I don't know if you heard the latest news, Izium, the city that the Ukrainians liberated. They found over 440 mass graves there. They have found 10 torture chambers there. Horrific. And I think that when, you know, thank God the journalists are there and documenting this, this is keeping Ukraine in the world's eyes. You know, they are seeing that we can't have this continue. So history is now repeating itself. Russia is committing genocide once again. We saw the Holodomor, and now this is another genocide, causing devastation and immeasurable suffering by its indiscriminate attacks. You've seen the bombings of the schools, the hospitals, the churches, the maternity wards that have been just destroyed. I don't know how many national treasures already that they have destroyed or stolen away from Ukraine. So they're finding mass graves and torture chambers, like I said, in the cities that Ukraine recently liberated. Millions of Ukrainian families are being separated, just as my parents were separated from their family for 50 years until the collapse of the Soviet Union. My grandfather never got to see his 2 oldest children because he died, you know, before Ukraine became independent. Over 1 million people have been forcibly deported to Russia, where they have the so-called filtration camps, maybe you read about them, and hundreds of children have been killed or injured or kidnapped and taken to Russia to be raised as Russians. more than 14 million people have been displaced, including members of my family. And thank God for the neighbors of Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, you know, where all those countries that border Ukraine have been so great. And America too has taken in 100,000 refugees. I just recently had 2 sisters, refugees from Kyiv, near Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, staying with me. And all they wanted to do was go back home. And they did. They recently just, you know, I took them to the airport, they went back home. So Russia's brutal war has not had the result that they anticipated, right? It served to unite and strengthen NATO. What's NATO stand for?
North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Ooh, your history teachers are really good. And what 2 countries just joined NATO?
Sweden and Finland.
And Sweden and Finland, right? So now how many countries are part of NATO?
17.
It's 32 now. 32. Ukraine wanted to join. Like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you see all those countries bordering Russia, they rushed to join NATO because they knew what Russia was like. Ukraine wanted to join NATO. And if we had joined, this would not have happened, but they didn't allow Ukraine to join. They said maybe later, you know.
What was the reason? Maybe.
They have all these requirements, and I think that they were afraid of Russia. They were afraid of Russia because Russia was a nuclear power and Russia threatened. You know, in the beginning they said, well, we're doing this because NATO is, we don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. And then it turned out to be, well, we just want to take over Ukraine, you know. So I think that's why, but unfortunately, Ukraine is still not part of NATO, but now it's been, it's not part of the European yet, but we're on the road to becoming part of the European Union, which is really important. What else happened? What else did the US and Europe do to help?
Send a lot of money.
Yeah, we are very, very grateful for the military, humanitarian support, because without that, we could not have won. But I think they see now how important it is, because you cannot let a bully like this get away with what they're doing. They also put sanctions on Russia, right? Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world. And over 1,000 businesses have left Russia. Over 1,000, yeah. So I think they're suffering. Putin just said, well, you know, he closed off Nord Stream 2 and stopped giving oil and gas to Europe. He said, oh, I'm closing this week, we have repairs to do on it. And then he said, well, if you lift the sanctions, we'll give you the oil and gas through there. So apparently those sanctions are making a difference.
There's something I don't understand.
Yes.
We have this bully and a country with a history of being just unmerciful. And then we have the rest of the world who thinks that's terrible. And we get an event like Russia driving, what was it, 400 military trucks out of the blue because they're going to do, quote unquote, military exercises. Now, doesn't the world get suspicious about that? I mean, does it have to be painted on the tanks and everything? I mean, the excuse was to do more, well, they'll press the button and it'll be a nuclear war. Well, you know, this guy's always threatening to press the button. But if everybody got together and said, rather than sending billions of dollars and then finally sending some military, just, what do we have the military for?
Yeah.
I mean, get hundreds of thousands of troops to march into the Ukraine.
Yeah, this could have been prevented.
I mean, rather than an
I
entire
think-
country destroyed that I saw on television,
Oh, it's
this beautiful country destroyed, all the buildings, and then the horrific murders and killings and
Yeah.
abductions. And I don't know if anybody agrees with me, but it just seemed to me. So now he's going to go somewhere else and do the same thing. This is exactly what Hitler did. He just said, I'm going there, and they just kept going and going and going and going.
Yeah. Well, hopefully now it's costing the world a lot more. You know, it's costing the US and Europe a lot more. If we had acted sooner, then maybe we could have prevented. Ukraine is not asking for boots on the ground, but they are asking for that military. The training to their soldiers have made a huge difference. And what they're sending, the weapons, it's made a huge difference. It's
But
one of
Russia
the
has
reasons.
10 times the amount of military
I know.
as the Ukraine could ever muster.
I know, and Ukraine is winning, because we can't lose. We can't let this monster take over, because we know what's gonna happen to those people there. They're gonna be, you know,
And it's going to be just the beginning. European Poland.
Yes.
yeah, and they know, that's why they're helping so much.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I just don't understand what prevented it. I mean,
I don't know, but,
mind-boggling.
yeah, yes.
I'm not sure this really adds to the conversation, but our son was in the military. He's fairly up in the military, and I believe it was 2020, United States sent, I can't tell you how many soldiers and
Yes.
military advisors to Poland
Yes,
to train,
Yes.
and it was the biggest training in, I believe, 20 years.
NATO
And-
alliance.
The what?
The NATO alliance.
Yeah, it was the NATO alliance, and the goal, in training was to train the existing military,
Yes.
people in Poland, or there may have been other soldiers from other countries, against the, Russian aggression. But that didn't work, it didn't work.
no, it did. It
It
made
did
a
work?
huge difference. The training that the Ukrainian army got made a huge difference, because they operate completely different than the Soviet military. The Soviet military has to wait for the top general to give the command to do anything. So those soldiers on the ground, they don't know what to do. Whereas the Ukrainian soldiers were trained by the Western governments, and they have their lower guys make decisions on the ground. They are much more fluid in what they can do, and that's made a huge difference. They all talk about the US training,
Oh, good.
that it has helped a lot. So,
Yeah, because our son-in-law was over there for quite some time.
yeah, yes,
Most of the generals were trained here in the States.
yeah,
Not
that's
just sort of the generals.
the generals, I'm sorry, the top command, and then they train down lower, yeah. And they have the Western military training, and that's made a big difference.
And having other boots on the ground, war is being fought again, with the United States. It's part of that war. Everything short of sending troops in.
Yes.
Because we're providing them Ukraine with everything,
Yes,
which is really why Russia has not taken over.
But
Yeah, but
I know that we
it's
have,
not at the
we
beginning.
have troops over there. I know that for a fact.
With
Right.
advisors.
Maybe they're advisors, but they're, well, I'm saying.
yeah.
I mean, I'm-
And the other difference this time around is the journalists and the photographers who are documenting these atrocities that are happening there. And that's what's making a difference in world opinion, that the world sees what's going on. They didn't see it in the 1930s when the genocide under Stalin was happening, but now the world is seeing it.
The satellites too.
The satellites, yeah,
Well, I just think, like, every time I see Zelensky, I feel like I want to cry,
Oh,
you know?
yeah.
Like, he's breaking my heart. I think he's doing a really good job in, getting world opinion
yeah.
on their side.
Absolutely, and he's been an amazing wartime president. Now he's being compared to Churchill. And initially, when the vote was going on, I wasn't for him. I was for the other guy. Because, you know, his story, he was a comedian, right? He had his own TV show, very successful businessman, and one day he played a history teacher on his show. And on the show, he made this passionate speech against corruption, and his speech went viral. And because of that, somehow, you know, he became a candidate for presidency. And he won by 70% against the incumbent president. And like,
You know what else really made me love him? His first speech as a president, the first year, he was talking a little bit of Russian, a little
Yes.
bit of Ukrainian.
he was trying to.
Last year, it was pure Ukrainian, not a single word. I mean, this is the man who is, I don't know if you saw the show, is very funny, Servant of the People
Yes, that
on
was his.
Netflix. It's very funny,
That was
and
his
he's a
show,
great,
and that became
a
his
great
party that
comedian.
he,
But he's
servant
a
of the
great
people.
president.
Yeah. And you know, when the war started, he was target number one because they wanted to replace the Ukrainian party with the Russian party. And the US said to him, you know, we will give you a way out of the country to escape. And he said to them, I need ammunition, I don't need a ride. And when people heard that, like everybody, like civic society in Ukraine is just so strong now. Everybody is there to help. And, you know, I want to say that we're grateful not just to, we're grateful to all the people in the world who've really stepped up and in one way or another, whatever they can, are doing what they can to help Ukraine. I just saw a little clip on Facebook. This little girl, maybe 3 years old, and she's putting, I don't know what it was, but she's putting something in her bag, and she tells her mom, this is for the soldiers. It was just so moving, you know, like everybody's helping. Even the grandmothers are doing what they can to help. So no other country has committed so many atrocities at once. They have nuclear terror, right? Energy terror, hunger terror, right? So we need to stop this reign of terror. We need to keep supporting Ukraine. And that's what we ask you. If you can contact your representatives, write to the representatives. I write to the president. I write to my senators and representatives asking them to keep supporting Ukraine in their fight for democracy, for freedom. It's so important. So I have some slides that I still want to talk about. And then if you have questions. So look at the scale of Ukrainian heroism, bravery. There's Ukraine and there's Russia. Right? We're not afraid of them. Just want to show you how beautiful Ukraine is. This is in the capital of Ukraine, St. Sophia Cathedral. It's one of the older cathedrals in Ukraine. And Kyiv is known as the Gold Dome City.
11th century.
11th century. It's known as the Gold Dome City because there are so many Gold Dome churches there. You'll go visit it someday. It's beautiful. So just to show you in comparison what Russia looked like. So this is Kyiv, founded in 482. Moscow was just forest at the time that Ukraine looked like this. And they tried to steal our history by saying it's Kyiv in Russia. It's not. It was Kyiv in Rus, R-U-S. That was the beginning. And then they stole the name and they took Russia. But that was the name. And this is Ukraine, much longer in existence.
By the way, they used to be called Muscovy until Peter,
The Tsars, yeah, Peter the
what
Tsar.
they call the Great, Peter the First.
Peter the First, we don't call him great.
Yes. So he changed the name from Muscovy to Russia.
Yeah, so just another, this is the port where finally grain is getting out. We were so afraid they're gonna destroy these national treasures. This is a theater in Odessa. That's the main port on the Black Sea that they're trying to get so that they landlock Ukraine. So that you might have seen, that's the trident. That's the symbol of Ukraine, like Americans have the eagle, we have the trident. If you tried wearing this during Soviet times, you'd be arrested. You couldn't have this.
And by the way, it's found
Coins.
on coins from what, 10th, 11th centuries.
Yeah. So this is when Russia first invaded Kyiv. There was a line of tanks 40 miles long going into the capital of Ukraine.
For military exercise.
Yeah. Well, at that point, we knew they invaded because they already were bombing the cities after February 24th. But this is the Russian tanks. Little by little, Ukrainians wiped them out. And, you know, they were not able to get the capital here. So this is the city where my mother taught as a Fulbright scholar, and this is one of the buildings there. This is before the war, and you can see the blue and yellow flags, Ukrainians protesting, we don't want Russia here. This is part of Ukraine, even though it's a Russian-speaking city, mostly, because it was of the Russification that I told you about. Well, take a good look at that building, because I'm going to show it to you after the war. Same building. And this is thousands of buildings destroyed. Another city destroyed. So this is when people were just escaping. Millions of people were escaping Ukraine once the war started, trying to get out, trying to get to the West. And, you know, men ages 18 to 60 are obligated to stay in Ukraine because if the military needs them, they are not allowed to leave. But so many women have joined the fight for freedom. I think it's got one of the largest armies, 50,000, they say, women have joined the army, and this is just a group of them here. And this is a price for freedom. Just one of hundreds and hundreds of people in the military who have lost limbs and lost lives and things. This is a bomb shelter in Kyiv. Kyiv has, it's in the metro system, the subway system, it's called Metro, and Kyiv has one of the deepest metro systems there is because they were specifically built as bomb shelters there. And this is, you know, when the war started, a teacher tried to teach a group of students in the bomb shelter. And these kids, they all know that word, bomboschovishche, which means bomb shelter. They're like growing up with these words. And this is just children sleeping in a bomb shelter. This is, I think this is from 2014. This is when Russia first invaded Ukraine there, and children just saluting the soldiers. So you know the Nazi symbol? Look how close it is to the Russian Nazi symbol now. Oh, the Nazis, right? The Z, that's their symbol of Russian occupation, aggression. So have you heard of the city of Bucha? Bucha is where they found horrific war crimes that the International Court Council is documenting now, hopefully, you know. But hundreds of people died here. And this was, they tell me, I don't know, but the people from Ukraine tell me this was a wealthy area. in Ukraine. And when the Russian soldiers came in and they saw the people had washing machines and this and that, like they just took everything and destroyed everything. So this is Zelensky surrounded by his men here versus Putin at that long table. I don't think this is a real photograph, but I just like what it says here, and you can read it. My cousin, who is from Eastern Ukraine, in 2014, they were trying to help the Ukrainian soldiers in the east, and they got attacked and hurt and all. And so they came here, tried to get political asylum. But after that, they were Russian speaking. They grew up Russian speaking in Eastern Ukraine there. They stopped. They switched completely to Ukrainian now, and they will not speak Russian. They say we need to get rid of everything Russian in our country because it's just destroying us. So this is eliminating Ukraine, which is what they want to do. They're eliminating the word Ukraine from their textbooks, like it doesn't exist. It's not a real country once they occupy it, once they take over. So they just, want to erase us.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
When I have friends, and like American friends, and they tell me, oh, well, Russian, Ukrainian is the same language. So I have two sentences, if you allow me to say that.
Sure.
I will say in Russian and then Ukrainian. I speak well Russian, I speak well Ukrainian. Okay, in Ukrainian you say, я очень хорошо говорю на русском языке. In Ukrainian you say, я дуже гарно говорю українською мовою.
Two different
Same
languages.
language?
Two different. And now, there's a letter in Ukrainian that is not in Russian. It's like with two dots. It's yi. So now Ukrainians are making that yi all over on the roads and all, just to, show them we're not you. This is a high school graduation. The kids wanted to take a picture in their school. And just to show resilience of Ukrainians. Look at this woman. Her house is destroyed, but she's still working in her garden here.
Excuse me,
Yes.
you should have a cousin Nastya, but the same age. Your cousin, she's about 86 or
She is
something. She
89.
was sent to Siberia when she was 15 or 14.
She what?
Was sent to Siberia when she was
Yeah,
a teenager, and she worked in rivers. No, the lumber with cut trees. She had to control the flow of those trees going in Siberia, in the water, like a young girl.
Wow.
She's the same age now. She's still cutting wood.
And she's coming, yeah?
She's amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
That generation's a tough
Yes,
generation.
yes.
Yeah, they went through a lot. A lot. So where is this? Yes, Times Square.
Times
So
Square.
just an example, all over the world, these demonstrations, these protests against the Russians. So many people have joined, the fight for freedom. And just found this cartoon. Is Ukraine there? And this is just another map of Ukraine. So we have relatives in Kyiv, we have relatives, Dnipropetrovsk, it's called Dnipro now, there. We have relatives in Kharkiv. See how close that is to the Russian border? That city was so many beautiful architecture there, and that has been so bombed there. Like if you're coming in to save Russian speakers, this is what you're doing. And you see how they took, one of the first cities they took was Kherson, just a little north of Yalta, Crimea. That's one of the first cities, so that's one of the cities we're trying to get back, because they were able to send missiles right up from Crimea, since they made it a military base when they took over in 2014. So, and they're trying to landlock Ukraine and take over all this southern part, which would destroy Ukraine economically, because it's such an agricultural country that exports so much grain there. So I think that's my last slide. If you have comments or questions or anything? Yes.
I just want to point out that, when you were talking about them taking the coastline, one of the major things that they wanted to do was take the city of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Mariupol.
And they, yeah.
And they did, but it's the size of Miami, and here's the horrific thing. It's a city larger than Miami. You know Miami's a pretty big city in Florida. They destroyed the entire thing. There's not a single building left standing.
Yes. So I don't know if everybody heard that, but one of the cities that they took over was on the south there, Mariupol, and totally destroyed Mariupol there. And then they took all those, the warriors, like Zelensky said, well, we need to stop fighting because too many people are dying here. So they took those warriors and they took them as prisoners of war to Olensky prison, and then they bombed it. They bombed that and killed so many of those prisoners of war. And I think it's to destroy evidence of war crimes, torture, because they tortured so many of these people there. But yes, thank you for bringing that up, yeah.
I think they want to hold referendums now. They want, what they did with Crimea, I think they want to do now.
Right, fake referendums, where when they occupy a country, they get rid of the pro-Ukrainian people, and then they hold their fake referendums and say, well, now this is part of Russia, right? So it's just...
I mean, momentum seems to be going in Ukraine's favor right now. Do you agree with that? Like,
that's what we're hearing. We're probably, I mean, the first thing I do in the morning is look at the news, and the last thing I do is look at the news about what's going on, because...
From what I understand, Putin's weakened.
Yeah, but we don't know what they can do. That's why it's so important for us to keep supporting Ukraine at this critical moment. I think they could really push a lot of Russia out, and especially those Russian soldiers are so demoralized, and Ukrainians are so upbeat about victory. I mean, I talk to any people, like we have a lot of refugees now in our community. They're all convinced Ukraine is going to win. There's no other choice.
The soldiers went in thinking that they were fighting Nazis. That's what they were told.
Yeah,
When they got there, they realized they weren't.
right, yeah. And some of them didn't even know they were going to fight, right? It's just, yeah.
I watched this interview of a Russian soldier that defected to the Ukrainian side, and he said that they were stationed on the border, and they were told they were going to fight NATO and Nazis, and they weren't told that they were going to invade Ukraine. They were just told to start walking, moving forward. They didn't even know that they were crossing the border into an independent and free country.
Yeah.
They thought they were just going to do an operation to kill Nazis to protect Russia, but it's not. They're actually...
Right, although some of those Russian soldiers have been brutal in what they have done. So a lot of them didn't know what was happening, but too many of them, once they got that power, it was horrific. So, yes.
What's interesting also is that in Ukraine, it's not only just Ukrainians. There's a lot of other different nationalities living in Ukraine, and they all prefer to live there permanently because they cite the freedom, the ability to do whatever they want to, just to do anything, and to come and study there at their well-acclaimed universities. So it's not only, again, Ukrainians fighting against the Russians, it's also other citizens from other nationalities fighting.
Absolutely. And particularly I want to mention Crimea, where the Crimean Tatars were first deported by Stalin, and so many of them died. They wanted to be part of Ukraine, and now they're destroying the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. You know, so we are working with the Crimeans, we're working with all of those other nationalities, you're right. Like, and even somebody said to me, well, that they were surprised that Kharkiv, that city up north there, right by Russia, where my mother taught, that Kharkiv, so close to Russia, a Russian-speaking city, how they did not want to be part of Russia. They did not. They saw what Russia did in eastern Ukraine and Donbass and how poorly those people lived there. They did not want to be in that. Anybody else? Well, you were a great audience. Should I tell you? Okay, I'll tell you a joke from Soviet times. So my uncle, I'll say it with my accent. When my uncle Mikola, he was a little boy in Soviet Ukraine, and the teacher asked him, Mikola, who is your father? And he said, my father is Father Lenin. Excellent, Mikola, very good, very good. And who is your mother? Well, my mother is Mother Russia. Excellent, very good, Mikola. Well, when you grow up, what do you want to be? And Mikola think, and he said, well, when I grow up, I want to be an orphan. Hopefully we can be orphans from that horrible country and get them out. And so your support, please keep the word going, please support. And thank you for coming today. Appreciate it. Thank you.